Hi everybody and welcome to episode 267 of The Art of Procurement. I'm your host, Philip Heitzen, and I want to thank you so much for joining me today. Now, according to today's guest, who's Procurement Insights founder, friend of the show, Jon Hansen, he was also on the show all the way back, I think it was around episode 33, so all the way in the beginning is nearly 4 years ago. So according to Jon, 70% of an organization's digital transformation activities actually pass through the procurement and supply chain functions. But is procurement prepared to step outside the frameworks of our historical job descriptions to actually proactively enable our companies to create and execute their digitization strategies? That's really the topic of today's show. So in the podcast, Jon and I discuss areas such as, why the unknowns of digitization are actually impacting executives across the company and not just in procurement. We discuss some of the key obstacles to digital transformation, and then what can procurement do to actually take a leading role in enabling enterprise digitization. Now, before I go into the interview, I do want to thank Tradov for their support of Procurement Thought Leadership and for sponsoring this episode of Art of Procurement. Tradov eliminates pain points for business buyers and sellers, whether that's purchasing urgency, unaligned buying and selling processes, a lack of communication and transparency within their own teams, and difficulties in discovering new suppliers. So one of the things that you can do with Tradov is build your own private network or community. You can do that for free. So for example, you can create a private network within Tradov where your entire procurement team can share information, post thought leadership, and start group discussions. It's a little bit of a hybrid of LinkedIn, Slack, and a wiki page that brings together all of your team's communications into one place. Then you can switch over to the public areas of Tradov, where you'll join a community of over 250,000 buyers and sellers. And as a buyer, you can post your supply needs, and Tradov will notify the best suited sellers across the world. So this gives buyers an opportunity to find new suppliers, receive multiple proposals, and become better informed on the market dynamics of the product or service that they are buying. So to join Tradov for free, whether to create a private network for your team or to discover new suppliers for your next sourcing event, just go to artofprocurement.com/Tradov. That's artofprocurement.com/Tradov. Okay then, well, let's go straight into my conversation with Jon, where I start by asking if he found procurement or if procurement found him.
Oh, that's an interesting question. It's funny when you look at procurement. It actually, for many people, when I came into business more than 20 years ago, it was something you fell into rather than making a conscientious decision to join that. So I guess the short answer to your question is I fell into it. And part of that came into the result of assuming responsibility for a major contract with the Department of National Defense, where they were looking to acquire indirect materials to support their IT infrastructure. And there was a contract existing that required an SLA delivery performance of 90%. And the company that brought us on and brought me into the picture to fix it, they were sitting at 51%. So they had to turn that around very, very quickly. Yeah. So obviously it wasn't just the logistics of how do you address that disconnect or that gap between what was contractually required and what was actually being delivered, but it was also how do you procure product? How do you procure MRO parts quickly for next day delivery to 35 different bases across the country? So it was a baptism, Phil, very much of fire at that particular point in time.
So your background is in IT, if I believe.
Yes. Yeah, in 1983, I go back when I really got into the IT field and started working in it. It was 1983. Hard to believe it was that long ago. But that was back in the days of CPM, which predated DOS. There was no IBM PC, the Charlie Chaplin one, for some of your audience listening who may not want to admit they're that old, but will be. Will remember that we had the Columbia PC, we had the K-Pro running the CPM, the Osborne was the portable computer. Many of these names now are, of course, gone with the exception of IBM. And even IBM, of course, sold their PC business to Lenovo. So, so back into the days of technology. And it was an interesting dynamic because providing solutions leveraging PCs, it was the early days of what's known as industry-specific applications. Okay. So that, for example, businesses would buy, let's say a chain of restaurants would buy PCs and have POS systems. but they didn't have software necessarily to run it. And so what you do is you go back in, and this is where you get involved with inventory. Restaurant was one in particular, Fisher Business Systems out of Atlanta back then, is that it would maintain or monitor all inventory right down to the actual ingredient usage. Mm-hmm. So if you sold a dish of, let's say, steak tartare or whatever else, whatever amounts of ingredients, a teaspoon of this, a tablespoon of that, whenever that dish sold, it would actually extract right down to the individual ingredient out of inventory electronically what went into making that dish. And then you print off weekly or bi-weekly an inventory report, and it would actually tell you right to that teaspoonful as to what you had consumed and what you should have in inventory. And it was an interesting perspective, because even then, you could see, even though technically it wasn't procurement or purchasing, but you can see how the link into inventory management came in, and then buying and reordering and replenishing. So, I mean, that's really where the PC background that I had, the high-tech background, started to merge over, because in much of the same way as I alluded to before, because I had that PC expertise, they brought me in. Mm-hmm. They brought me into what you would call, I guess, to fix that problem, come up with software that would work for them. And that's exactly what I did. I took those experiences from the early days of the PC into the D&D contract, and ultimately expanded from there, and it became procurement.
Yeah, it's interesting. It sounds like very much like in automotive, which is where I got my start, having the bill of material. But at a much, granular level, I guess I never even thought about applying those same principles to the concept of, essentially inventory for a meal in a restaurant. You think about it in a manufacturing environment, but you don't necessarily think about it in a restaurant, for example.
Well, you see, and that's an interesting point, because I just wrote a paper for a purchasing association, or the introduction and overview. And, you talk about it, if you look at what you call a smartphone in somebody's hand, or a car driving by, or eating in a restaurant, ironically, and maybe that's the interesting thing that's happened with our industry, the procurement world, that is that there isn't a part of our life that procurement and supply chain does not touch. Mm-hmm. Back then, 20 years ago, purchasing was, as our mutual friend Kelly Barner once said, wrote in the opening of a book we wrote together, is that purchasing is where you send someone to banish them away from the real world. Yeah. But in reality, I mean, now what's happening is that we're seeing that supply chain drives everything, and digital transformation, hence IT world. I mean, now we know it's so intimately and intricately linked with how we procure goods and services. And it's becoming apparent now that, look, you can't say digital without procurement, and procurement without digital, especially since McKinsey, for example, talked about the fact that 70% of all digital transformations in business will be delivered through the supply chain. So, if somebody says they've been in IT, chances are there has been some touch points with procurement, and now that's becoming a more blended world.
Yeah, I actually want to come back to that in a minute. I wanted to first just ask you mentioned about our mutual friend Kelly Barner, and you wrote a book together. So that book was Procurement at a Crossroads, and I looked back in the archive. It was all the way back in episode 32 about a procurement. We talked about it, which is crazy now to think about it, but that was three and a half years ago. And you talked a lot about embracing the future, and that, there may be a tiered procurement professional. There's basically the haves and the have-nots. The haves are the ones that embrace the change. The have-nots the ones that don't, or maintain the status quo. And that's really influenced me in my thinking over the last 3 or 4 years. I'm interested, as you look back on that, has anything changed in your mind? Are we moving quicker, slower than you expected? Are we pretty much the same place, or just kind of waiting for something? I just love your opinion now that you've got 3 years, in the rearview mirror from when you wrote that book.
Well, it's interesting, and that book was intentionally myopic, focusing just on the procurement industry. But stepping back now, if you're to look at the bigger picture, the digital transformation of the way we work, the way we do business, is causing all professions to have to evolve. Yeah. The chief financial officer's job is changing. Interesting. Gartner did a study, and they found that CMOs, chief marketing officers, will actually spend more on IT than CIOs. Mm-hmm. And the logic on that front is that CMOs have the customer-facing relationship, and they're more intuitive to the technology. And as the technology becomes more consumerized, which is what all the experts and pundits are saying, it has to become more intuitively useful, and reflect how people work at home and utilize these devices. You're going to find that there's going to be this splintering and redefinition. So if I were to look back on it, what's affecting procurement is actually affecting everyone. Yeah. And the changes that opens up is that the traditionally defined roles are no longer applicable. Yes, a CFO will still look after finances, but they have to step out of that realm and look at the new business models of how they work, and there has to be a greater collaboration. CIOs are no longer the gatekeepers for technology coming into the enterprise, and part of that, Phil, is that people, what was it? IDC said in 2010 there were 1.94 personal IoT devices per person globally. And by 2020, next year, that'll increase to nearly 10 IoT devices. So what's happened is the mystery surrounding technology has been removed. And what we've learned about buying through the Amazonization effect, through all these other factors, are redefining everything. There's no mystery about technology anymore. And so here's what's happening is that, going back specifically to procurement, but extending that, there is a growing talent gap that's happening out there. And there's not enough qualified people stepping into the roles to make the transition to a digital world, not just a digital supply chain, but a digital enterprise. And that's probably one of the reasons why, the McKinsey study, another one, talked about the fact that just 23% of companies, of the 1,600 executives they surveyed, well, there was universal recognition that digital is obviously the way we're all going. Only 23% actually had a digital reinvention strategy, and just 2% of those had a supply chain strategy surrounding digital transformation. So, we're in this holding pattern because there's not the talent that exists anymore, and the existing talent is not suited to being able to step up and actually take the mantle on that. So we're in a very interesting point of crossroads here. But the crossroads extends beyond procurement.
Right.
It is across the whole board.
Yeah, there's kind of a lot to unpack there. And one of the things I wanted to come back to first was actually that comment that, we sometimes live in our own bubble of procurement and feel that there's all this change happening around us, and that, we're having to address this change in a world where everything else around us is the same. And the reality is that every single departmental head, functional area, professional within that functional area, is kind of fighting with the same challenges as we are, and wondering what the heck is their role going to be in this future organization. So it's not just us that's having these fears and kind of this insecurity, if you will.
I agree with that. And that's going back to your original question, in the context of my elongated answer, is that the difference between 3.5 years ago and now is that the breadth of impact. Mm-hmm. And that procurement people have to step forward now and think outside of the framework of traditional job descriptions, and look at the fact that they're going to have to become technologically savvy. But many of them are, because of virtue of how we use technology at home. I mean, what we're doing right now, for example, and the technology that we're using to communicate. I mean, that's really the only difference, is the breadth of impact and change. And the opportunities it presents.
Now, you mentioned that there's no mystery around tech, I think is what I wrote down here that you said. And, I feel that's true, but I'm not sure if it's true in the enterprise, because there's still an unknown of what technology can really do for us. And a lot of organizations, just by virtue of probably challenging investment environments, haven't really been able to invest that much money in tech. I guess my question is it the role of procurement, do you feel, to help those other functional areas going through those changes? Is it our job to help them understand what technology is on the outside and how they can use that to their advantage, or is that kind of out of our realm of responsibility?
No, I think that's very much in our realm of responsibility in terms of assuming a leadership mantle. I mean, if you look at it, why are enterprises in a holding pattern? And there's a number of reasons why. The talent gap is a big one. Mm-hmm. The other one that keeps organizations in a holding pattern is the fear that technology or technological advancement is moving at a far faster pace than the ability of the organization to keep up from a cybersecurity standpoint. An organization, University of North Carolina, I believe, did a study and found that traditionally the number one fear for executives and board members was, the economic, the condition of the economy, and of course regulatory compliance. Mm-hmm. That has now been usurped. The number one fear for organizations, the top people in organizations, is the fact that technology has advanced so quickly that they're being forced to go into it, but they feel vulnerable because they don't feel they have the security to be able to deal with it. And I think that's a key area here. I mean, so going back to your question, well, whose responsibility is that to address those kinds of fears? And I think it's a wide open horizon there that procurement has to step up. We're not just buying things anymore. It's funny. I interviewed Kevin Piesker at the time he was the new president of Microsoft. He's still there, of course. And he talked about the fact is that when it comes to purchasing, you can no longer, or any position, you can no longer do a checklist of responsibilities. You can no longer say, well, I did this, and this. This is, there's no, you've got to be able to think outside of the box. You've got to think creatively. And I hate using those terms, Phil, simply because they become so ubiquitous, they're almost meaningless.
It's like a cliche.
Like win-win. But the reality is that the organization is waiting for people to step up. And procurement is ideally positioned, partly because of what I alluded to earlier. The survey that McKinsey's study that found that 70% of all digital transformation is going to be delivered through procurement. Mm-hmm. So who's better to own that but procurement? So yes, our job is to facilitate that. Our job is to understand and address those areas of transformation within our enterprise or within the enterprise with which a procurement professional is working, and realize that they have to bring to the table more than just the old mandate of get the best price. Right. They've got to bring to the table a variety of skill sets, including technological comfort and savviness, relational mindsets that are based on an environment of transparency and not one of a zero-sum game, which still exists, sadly, in many cases. With many organizations. And one, just to digress a bit, during a webinar I gave, one of the questions that came from the audience, and we had about 120 people participating in the webinar in attendance, said, yeah, but what if I'm with an organization that doesn't recognize or embrace the direction we're going, but is still locked in the fact is, here's a list of things to order, find the cheapest price. Mm-hmm. And my response, and it's a loaded response, is, well, then it's time for you to look for another place to work. Because those organizations who are not stepping forward and leveraging the strategic importance of supply chain, of procurement, and all that it can bring to the table are going to be organizations that are going to languish. And, we have to get by this mindset of, and I'll refer to Jim Collins as good to great. I mean, there are many companies like Westinghouse and other organizations that are no longer around that were huge in their time, but they didn't adapt to the way in which the world works. And so you need to look at it and say, as a procurement professional, does the organization facilitate participation in the emerging digital economy? Does it facilitate my ability to expand my knowledge? Because curriculums are changing out there. And if you can't apply it within your own organization, you better find an organization that you can.
Yeah, it's interesting that, I see a greater divergence, I guess, between those organizations who are embracing the need to look at the procurement value proposition and evolve the procurement value proposition, and those that aren't. And those that do are always going to, probably more so than ever before, are going to be the magnet for the best talent. And as you said before, being a talent gap means they're going to be able to hoard the best talent. And those that don't are just going to lose the best talent, and there isn't necessarily a good pipeline to replace that talent with. So you think about what that means for the future of procurement. Does it mean that you're going to have a few organizations where there's this really fantastic practices and procurement's really making a difference? Or are we going to have those organizations kind of dragging everybody along and increasing the I guess, the entire procurement profession in terms of its capability, or is it just going to be like an us and a them? And I don't know the answer to that, to be honest.
Well, you know what, I think people are starting to find, and that's this holding pattern we're finding ourselves in. I mean, that's one of the key things there is why only 23% of companies, why do they only have a digital strategy? On the other side, out of those, why just 2% only have a supply chain strategy around digital? I mean, you've got to look at those things and wonder, why is that the case? And where's the holdup? So I think a lot of people are still asking that question that you just asked, and they're looking for answers, but no one's stepping up.
Yeah.
No one's coming forward and saying, this is an area we're going to handle. This is what we're going to do. A lot of organizations are just sitting there and they're, again, stuck in a holding pattern.
Yeah, it's interesting when you talk about digital strategy, who owns a digital strategy? Does procurement fit into a broader enterprise digital strategy, or does procurement own their own? And, I've seen both within organizations, but those that are more the reactive types are just waiting to be told what to do, and those that are the most proactive are setting their own strategy.
Well, it's kind of interesting what you say, because digital strategy must be driven from the top. Mm-hmm. It must be driven from the top, but so if you were to say in the traditional realm, that's where the ownership resides, perhaps. But realistically speaking, is a digital strategy is a collective ownership. It's a collaboration, and that's where a lot of organizations tend to fall down. Yeah. Is that they've never really had this communication. They've all worked in silos of functionality, and there hasn't been a collaboration or a communication. And that's one of the things that's really the key to digital. It's at a grassroots level. Is how do you communicate and collaborate the role of things? What role? How do you redefine the roles within the enterprise? And that's why people again are in a holding pattern. Mm-hmm. I mean, we look at the three obstacles. We look at the talent pool. That's number one. If you have a talent gap and it is growing globally, that's the number one problem, digital transformation. And we already talked about cybersecurity being another. Then you go to the third area, and I want to get into this now because this is all part of that understanding in terms of who owns it, but cleaning up data, data. Organizations, it's an interesting scenario you find there is a lot of organizations abdicate that responsibility. And Rob Hanfield talked about a large company, organization, a high-tech company, that had said, you know what, we're going to get SAP Ariba, for example, and they'll clean up our data for us. Yeah. But they can't do data cleansing. They're not capable. A vendor or a service provider cannot do that. That has to be a decision made internally and how it's done. And one of the interesting conversations I had was with Bob Siebert from NASPO, which represents all the CPOs for each of the 50 states. And he said, the biggest mistake you make in clean data, the biggest mistake is trying to clean it all. Mm-hmm. You have to be able to ascertain what data means the most to you. Yeah. And then go in there and clean that. And, some of the stuff you're going to leave. Some of it you're not going to cleanse. Some of it you're not going to use. And that's something that people have to get their head around, is you have to become selective as to the data cleansing process, because no one has the cycles or the time to do it. I talked to the former CPO of Scotland. I talked to anyone on all sides of the pond, both sides of the pond, and they all come back saying the same thing. It has to be done, but we don't have the cycles to do it. Mm-hmm. And so they usually abdicate it to the provider, and the provider is not equipped to do that because that's not their data. And data cleansing is somewhat complex and a very personal internal thing. So, those things together, that's where the collaboration, going back to your question, who owns it? That's where the collaboration starts. How do you address the talent gap? How do you address the security issue? How do you address the data cleansing issue? And I don't think you can make that digital. That's why each department can't have its own digital strategy, because you have to do that collectively as an organization. So, I spoke to John Mellon, who's VP over at NetApp, and he said they had an approach that they took where they created a group of people from different areas of the business. And they were able to move forward with a strategy that allowed them to transform their enterprise, because NetApp's history shows one of changing from a core competency or business to an entirely new core competency in business successfully, one of the few companies to do it, largely because they removed these silos. So I think we have to think beyond the borders of, it's a procurement function, it's a finance function, it's an IT function, and have a group come together. And I think leading that charge is a wonderful opportunity for procurement people to do that.
Now, when you think about the talent pool, and you said there's not enough qualified people, do you feel that that organizations kind of need a center of excellence around digital strategy, or whether there should be, and there needs to be, technological savvy across every single person in every single role?
I think there has to be a bit of technological savvy across the board. We're no longer dealing with a specialist who's dealing with, again, an isolated capability. Now, yes, digital capability and technological capability and know-how are important, but let's face it, Phil, we all are now digitally capable. Like, if you think about it, we use iPhones. We're online. We're on the internet. We order through Amazon or wherever else. We're all technologically, we're beyond the bring your own device to work type of scenario. Everyone must be technologically advanced, from Google to Siri giving us directions in the car, to smart homes that are being built in smart hospitals. Now, here's an interesting point. I'm going to digress here. I interviewed the CIO from the city of Vaughan, which is just outside of Toronto, and they're building the very first smart hospital in the country. And I asked the CEO, so what was your involvement? Do you know what his involvement was with that project? Absolutely nothing. It was not a technological program. Now, he was involved and engaged, and they did have technological input at the different hierarchies throughout the government. But at the end of the day, the CIO, who would traditionally be involved in a smart hospital driving that initiative, was not driving it. Just like the CMO is going to spend more than the CIO on customer-facing technology. And that's the point. The roles are changing based upon demand and understanding, and there has to be a transitory capability and understanding across the board.
So, as we're all getting more technologically savvy, and one of the things that's always been interesting to me, is that, and I speak more from my own personal background, so I don't want to say this is, it wouldn't be fair to say that this is kind of common practice, but, as I was probably growing up in the early days of my procurement career, I would look at stakeholders and think, well, they don't know how to buy. I'm the specialist. I've been trained to be a procurement person. They're just going out and they're leaving all this money on the table or all this value on the table or whatever because they don't understand how to buy. And then you realize, as you mature, that of course they know how to buy. They buy their own cars. They buy their own houses. Like you say, they're shopping on Amazon every day. And yet we still have this kind of fascination with trying to bring as much spend under management as possible. To me, I feel like the future for procurement is more to enable self-service, within some guide rules and, having technology to support it, rather than this chase to just bring everything under our purview and to kind of touch everything. I just wonder if that's something that you see or that you hear from folks, and what your opinion is on that.
The companies that are being progressive, the 23%, and hopefully that number is growing, they're moving in that kind of a direction. Again, and it goes back to what I said previously as well. We're redefining how we work and what we do, and the roles that each is playing within the enterprise. So, I think that's a given, what you just said, and it's an important realization. The problem is that the majority of organizations are still stuck in old ways of thinking, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So how can they help themselves be unstuck? I wonder, because if we're all kind of stuck in this status quo and in these holding patterns, what's going to break that?
Well, I think it comes down to will from the top. I think it comes down to a recognition of how organizations are changing because of technology. Now, the one saving grace here, and this is the unifying factor, because, we've always heard about the ivory tower and not knowing what it's like on the front lines. The contributing factors in the old days to maverick spend, where contracts were negotiated centrally but didn't reflect what the buyers knew was the best arrangement, the best acquisition they could do locally. What's happening now, the great equalizer, is whether you're the CEO of a company or you're in the shipping warehouse of the company, you're all now on a level experience of the technology because everybody has a smartphone. Everybody's using technology. Everyone's doing, most everyone's doing electronic banking. So we're all familiar with it. And I think, unlike any other time in history, that cross spectrum of familiarity is the common denominator of talking, so that you can sit down and say to somebody who's in a warehouse, well, this is what we're trying to do with the customer, and they can see their role in it. And I think the smart organizations accept that uniformity of understanding and begin to involve these people. Remember, I talked about NetApp a few moments ago, bringing everyone to the table, not by definition of what they've traditionally done, but by the roles they play within the organizations, and create a collective whole. I mean, a supply chain, and everyone talks about end-to-end, involves different aspects of an enterprise, different aspects of the business, whether you're in a warehouse, shipping, whether you're in sales, it's all interconnected now. And I might add, extending beyond the enterprise itself to your supplier, vendor relationships and the implications there. So you're no longer dealing with this complexity of the days of XML and before that EDI. You're now dealing with a truly interconnected world, and everyone understands that, or conceptually understands that, if not in a specific function within their organization, how it will work within a specific function.
Yeah. You talked about NetApp then and bringing all the a lot of people to the table. One of the things I think that we overlook, and I've seen this, from some of our clients as well, to be honest, when we do some consulting and help folks with their digital transformations, is that there's this expectation that, technology is the silver bullet. When, you can implement technology, you can have a technology strategy, but you're still not likely to get the ROI that you expect if you don't look at that as part of a bigger puzzle, around the people side, around the process side.
I think, it's interesting you use the term silver bullet, because I think now you're older than I thought you were. Technology used to be seen as the silver bullet, but here's the reality of it, is that if you look at technology through the proper lens, and I think many organizations are doing that now, and you look at the three obstacles, people are realizing the technology is important as a vehicle, but there is no real ROI in the traditional sense. Organizations used to invest millions of dollars, whether it was an Oracle or J.D. Edwards before Oracle bought them and whatever else. And most of these initiatives failed miserably. But you had an investment to recover, and you were invested in that technology more. Today's service providers, you don't have the same degree of investment, not in the technology side of the equation. In the consulting side, it's a whole different matter for a whole nother day. But on the actual technology side of it, we deal in a SaaS world. We deal with an on-demand world. So that instead of years to get something up and operational, it can be done in a matter of days or weeks. And you can measure the results because it's functional that much faster. So ROI, I think, in and of itself has been redefined, where you now look at it from the standpoint of the impact on the enterprise in terms of increased revenue, in terms of increased customer satisfaction, hence the CMOs assuming greater responsibility for IT purchasing than CIOs. You're looking at a whole different realm of measurements here that weren't traditionally looked at collectively. They were looked at more, again, in those silo areas and almost kept secretive one to the next. Procurement was given its marching orders, go out there and make it happen. So I think within the organization, what you're finding here is that technology isn't the silver bullet, but technology, because of the sheer ease at which it can be implemented, has shone the light back now on where the problems exist. And the problems exist. It's never been about technology. That's the whole thing. People used to think technology used to drive company success. It doesn't. It's a vehicle to do that. It's secondary to the talent pool you have. It's secondary to the cleanliness of your data. It's secondary to the security measures that you have to protect that data. And that then becomes a whole different discussion and a whole different measurable ROI. So nobody looks at technology as being the ROI element of it. They look at it as being the exposure of weaknesses or exposure of weaknesses within the enterprise. And that's really where I think the dramatic shift has come.
Yeah, and I think there's probably room to go from the procurement perspective in going in that direction. And then maybe that's because it's sometimes difficult for a CPO to go and talk about an ROI of a technology investment in procurement to be revenue based and not cost savings based, for all the historical reasons that, you know, I could spend the next hour talking about. You know, the cost savings, I guess, challenge that we have in terms of the way that we're perceived. But, you know, I often see when I see organizations who have struggled, you know, with their technology implementation for the first time, and you have executives looking around saying, well, you didn't meet the business case. It's because a lot of times, you know, business cases are probably optimistic in terms of, you know, you're going to implement some procurement technology and it's going to save you all this money just by having a technology in place. And, you know, there's the business case numbers come from all kinds of different places, whether it's efficiencies, which you can tie it a little bit closer to, but also it's going to uncover all these cost savings opportunities. And, you know, they're kind of built into the ROI. So I do think we have some work to do, you know, there.
Yes. But you know what's interesting about this, and that's part of the redefining of the roles that are taking place. Remember, we can't just look at it from a cost-saving standpoint. We have to look at it, again, procurement professionals have to look at it from a sales figure standpoint, a customer satisfaction standpoint, a cost-saving standpoint. And that means the demands for all of these people is going to change dramatically. And that's where the resistance is coming in, I think, to a certain degree. I was speaking for an audience in several audiences, and I did surveys with each of the audiences and asked, how many of you, if you could do it all over again, would choose or would have chosen a different profession than procurement? And at least 50% of the audience raised their hand saying we wouldn't have come into the procurement realm. Now, here's the interesting thing. One might think it's the longtime senior people in there who are just saying, the world's changing too fast, I'm just going to ride it out. But a good percentage of those were the millennials who had just come into the business. You see, so, you know, I think what's happening is there's a shift in mind focus, the way of doing things, and what constitutes a procurement professional. And that definition is changing. And the ones who are able to recognize and adapt to that and expand their knowledge net to be able to understand impact throughout the enterprise in various areas of the enterprise, and vice versa. Finance people, CIOs, CMOs, everyone has to understand how each of their parts work together and the impact it has. Otherwise, they'll not come up with what I call a clear line of sight. And, you know, I talked about this, Phil, as an example, and I'll use a procurement example to illustrate this point. When the H1N1 virus was, I think H1N1, when it came out in Mexico, to try to curb the spread of it, they only kept essential businesses open. And it was interesting because the ones that they considered essential was the pharmaceutical companies producing the vaccine. They didn't consider the cardboard packaging companies as being essential. And so they closed those down. But here's the problem. Without the packaging, they couldn't ship the vaccine. Do you see what I'm saying? An unintended consequence from a broken line of sight. Now, that's a procurement story or a supply chain story, but extend that. Within the enterprise, you must have a clear line of sight all the way through, an understanding of how that works, so that whatever role you step into taking in the organization, you'll have a clear knowledge as to where that affects and who that affects and what it contributes to the bottom line. Right now, I would hazard a guess, Phil, that if you were to ask the majority of procurement people, what is your effect on the bottom line profitability of your company? Beyond anecdotal answers and responses, I would suggest it's hard pressed that they have any clue. If you were to go to them and say, okay, what is the level of customer satisfaction? Repeat orders, things like that. I would hazard a guess that they would have no clue. And this is I'm using procurement because that's the field we're in. Well, in the new emerging world, the digital world, they're going to have to know those answers. And that's really that's really the call out and the challenge, is that you have to go beyond that traditional realm of, I was given something secure, I secured it for the best price, and that's it. I don't want to know anything else. And and as new generations come in, as the technology creates greater transparency, what you are going to have happen is that there's going to be access to areas of information, insight that weren't previously available. And that's where procurement professionals have to recognize and move into their roles, their new roles and expanded roles. It's no longer a spectator sport.
Well, I'm going to leave it on that with that call to action, with an inspiring call to action for procurement professionals, procurement leaders, thinking about, kind of where they need to be focusing, what they need to be doing over the next, week, a month, 6 months, a year, whatever it is. Like, how can you start to get that line of sight and really build true alignment? For me, it all comes back to alignment with the business. If you don't have that line of sight, you can't have alignment with the business. And if you don't have that alignment, you don't know what they truly want. And ultimately, you're only going to create value for folks if what you're doing is so compelling for the business, they want to come back for more. Without that, people will find another way to get what they want without going through procurement.
Absolutely. And for companies, procurement professionals who are in tune with that, if you don't create that environment for them, they'll move. And it's an interesting world we live in. It's no longer cradle to grave employment. The average person changes jobs every 2 to 3 years, and those who possess these skills are the ones who are demanding the highest salaries and are getting the greatest benefits. So, there's also a monetary consideration as well.
Well, Jon, if anyone is listening, they'd like to, learn a little bit more about you and what you do, or connect with you directly, where's the best place for them to find you?
Well, what you can do is you can go to Google and just type in Procurement Insights, and I'll pop up.
All right, you own that space. You own Procurement Insights for Google.
And Phil, it's the virtue of being 60. It's also a virtue of being having Procurement Insights since May 2007, one of the first blogs in the industry. There's certain value with getting a little long in the tooth.
Your first mover advantage.
That's right.
So what I'll do is I will, if you do that, go to Google, search for Procurement Insights, but I'll also include the URL to your website in the show notes for today's episode. That's going to be at artofprocurement.com/podcasts. That's artofprocurement.com/podcasts. And then just, search for Jon, or you'll see this episode in the recent shows that are listed there. So, Jon, one last time, I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Phil, it's always a pleasure, and I look forward to the next time we can talk and meet in person. I think it's been a couple of years since we've seen each other, so hopefully our paths will cross there as well.
Yeah, hopefully our conference seasons align somewhere soon.
There you go.
All right, thanks, Jon.
Hi there, I want to thank you for tuning in to today's podcast. You can check out all of our back catalogue at artofprocurement.com/podcast, where you can also subscribe to our newsletter to make sure that you never miss an episode. And if you found value in today's show, I'd love if you would tell a peer, or perhaps go and rate and review by going to artofprocurement.com/review. Word of mouth really is the best way to help the podcast grow, and if you're able to do either one of those things, I would truly appreciate it.